Okay, can you hear me? You can hear me? Okay, good. Sorry about that. Okay, so, um, yeah, my computer did a big die. It had a blue screen of death. How have I been? Pissed. But with my computer, that's par for the course. It's pretty much expected. Anyway, so as I was saying, the indicative mood is we use it when we want to express facts or statements. So when we want to be objective, and the subjunctive mood is used for when we want to express something other than reality. We want to express things that aren't real, things that we want to happen or things that we wish could happen, so on and so forth. And regarding this question I asked earlier, which would be, what is grammatical mood? Well, grammatical mood is just something that expresses how a speaker feels about what they're saying. So it expresses a speaker's attitude towards whatever they're saying. So if the speaker wishes to use the indicative mood, then they're being objective. For the subjunctive mood, they're being subjective, or rather, what they're saying is subjective. So yes, that's what grammatical mood is. It just expresses how the speaker feels about what they're saying, or about a certain situation. And the imperative mood deals with commands. You guys remember the imperative mood? It's all about commands. Like, go here, do this. And of course there's a conditional mood as well. Although some people don't even consider that a separate mood. But it deals with conditions. Like if-then statements or whatever. Well, not those in general, but the conditional mood is often used in if-then statements. So, for example, if you had worked on your assignment earlier, you would have been able to turn it in on time. That would have been able, or whatever. That's the conditional mood. But here, let me type all these here. So you have 4 moods in English. So there's the indicative, facts and statements, the subjunctive, requests and wishes, the imperative, commands, and the conditional, which just deals with conditions. Let me see if I can, hold on one moment. So those are the 4 moods in English. And the conditional mood can be expressed with would, with the verb would, or it can even be expressed with the verb might or could as well. The verbs might and could also express the conditional mood. And what I mean by the conditional mood expressing conditions, what I mean by that is that, so if you all remember, a condition, so when you have a condition, that is basically a requirement for something else to happen. So for example, a condition that you get an A in a class, in any class, is that you have a grade point average or grade or whatever, that your overall grade is 90 or above. That will get you an A. that's a condition. If you don't meet that condition, that is, if you get less than 90, you don't get an A. So that's what I mean by condition. No, declarative refers to the type of sentence. It's not really that a declarative statement is like that's just a type of sentence. That's a different topic. I mean, I guess it does, like, declarative statements, I guess they do, like, they are used in the indicative mood, but that's, like, I would consider that a different concept. The indicative mood uses declarative statements, though. Yeah, that's true. But those are, to me, those are separate concepts. Yeah, if you have taken programming classes, then you know how conditions work. So if this, then this. Okay. So knowing this, we can, I forgot to mention something earlier regarding the past simple and past continuous. I don't think or the future simple and future continuous, but I guess I can go back and cover that later. But anyway, so in the subjunctive mood, how many tenses do we have? How many tenses? Two. Yeah, exactly, two. Past and present. Yes. We have just two. We have two subjunctive tenses, past and present. We don't have a future subjunctive, unfortunately, sad face. That's something that only Spanish and Portuguese have. They have the future subjunctive, we don't in English. We just have only the present and past subjunctive forms. We have only those forms. So knowing this, you can combine remember, just like in the indicative mood, you can also combine tense and aspect in the subjunctive mood. So you could have a present subjunctive, a present continuous subjunctive, so oops, let me just write this out. Dang it, what the heck? Why can't I move my cursor? Oh, there we go. Now I can move it. Okay. You can have a present perfect subjunctive and a present perfect continuous subjunctive. So you can have all four of these. You can have a present simple subjunctive, a present continuous subjunctive, a present perfect subjunctive, and a present perfect continuous subjunctive. So you can say something like this. So a normal subjunctive sentence would be something along the lines of something like this. I recommend that he visits a doctor. I recommend that he visits a doctor. Here we're using the present simple subjunctive. I recommend that he visits a doctor. No, in the subjunctive, for the subjunctive you use the base form. So visit is technically correct. So with the subjunctive, you just use the base form. You don't conjugate for person, or you technically do, but everyone receives the same conjugation. So it would be, I visit, you visit, he visit, she visit, it visit, we visit, you visit, they visit. I recommend that he visit a doctor. I pronounced it as visits. I don't think I did, because then that would have sounded like I recommend that he visits a doctor. I just said I recommend that he visits a doctor. Yeah, or I suggest you see a doctor. Or it's necessary that she visits a therapist. Or it's essential that we maintain focus on this task. Again, you're using the base form of the verb. You are using the base form. So no S ending or anything like that. No, with wish you have to use the past subjunctive, but we'll get to that later. It's essential that we maintain focus on this task. But yeah, with the subjunctive, it deals with the present subjunctive, you use it for recommendations, requests, demands even, anything like that. So, and there are typical expressions that use the subjunctive, such as it's critical that, or it's necessary that, or I demand that. Those things take the subjunctive. But there are contexts where you can use either the indicative or the subjunctive. So I suggest that can take either the indicative or the subjunctive. So what's the difference here? I suggest that he has a girlfriend. I suggest that he have a girlfriend. What's the difference here? It's both cap. He doesn't have one. To have is subjunctive. So what's the difference in meaning here? Not quite. Not quite. Not quite. You're kind of on the right track, Serenity. The second sounds like imperative. Sort of. The imperative is kind of like the subjunctive, kind of, but not exactly. Kind of. Kind of. Okay, so the difference between these two sentences here, I suggest that he has a girlfriend, indicative, and I suggest that he have a girlfriend, subjunctive. The difference is that in the first one, someone thinks or believes that some guy has a girlfriend, whereas the second one means that the guy doesn't have a girlfriend, but someone wants him to have a girlfriend. So that's the difference. So in the first one, in the indicative sentence, someone believes that he has a girlfriend, whereas the second one means that he doesn't have a girlfriend, but someone wants him to have one. So that's the difference. Yeah, if you can't hear me, try reconnecting. And another example of where either mood can be used is this example. Hold on. Here's another example where either mood can be used. I insist that my brother is here. I insist that my brother be here. So what's the difference here? Yeah, I'm speaking. I might have to... Hold on, one moment, hold on. Okay, can you hear me now? The first one says that he's there. The second one tells us that the person wants him there. Exactly. The first one is that you are sure about that fact. The other one is more of an order, in my opinion. Exactly. Yeah, that's the difference. I insist that my brother is here. You want. I'm sorry. You believe that your brother is here. You strongly believe that your brother is here. Whereas the second one means that you just want him to be there. You want him to be here. And I should also point out that in some dialects of English, in British English anyway, sometimes, yeah, exactly, the latter implies that that they want the brother to be there, but he's not there. Sometimes people might say this instead, to you as an alternative to the subjunctive. I insist that my brother should be here. That's an alternative that some people use. So if they don't want to use the base form of the verb, they just use the should in there. They just put a should. They just put a should. That's technically fine as well. It's just that that's something that we don't do in American English for the most part. That's something that you will see much more often in British English. But either way, whether or not you use the verb should, like either's fine. You can put a should there, or you can take it out. But just know that in American English, we don't really use should for the most part. We don't use it like that. I mean... Okay, so... You might even see sentences like this. You might even see sentences like this. This requires that the value should be 1. Instead of this requires that the value be 1. So you might see both forms after requires. Now, personally, I would use the second form because, well, the verb require by nature already implies that something should happen for something else to happen. So the should here is redundant, in my opinion. But but it's not wrong to put a should there. It's redundant, but it's not wrong. But I do see people write things like that because they just don't want to use the bare form. That's fine. Yeah, exactly. It's more common to just take the should out, and with good reason because requires already implies that something should happen. But if you want to put the should in there, you can. But what about contexts like this? Oh my god, my mom is annoying the hell out of me. Hold on, I'll be right back. Okay, sorry. Um, I love programming. I love C++. Exactly, Serenity. You have good taste. Okay. So here's an example where the verb forms. Oh, you're welcome, Serenity. Where the verb forms are quite ambiguous. It's important that you bake me cookies. It's important that you bake me cookies. Well, what's the difference? You just tell from the context. Because really, like, bake here could be either indicative or subjunctive. See, when it comes to verb conjugation, English is very, very lazy. Because here, the indicative, a lot of the time, looks like the subjunctive form. So, how do you tell the difference? You just rely on the context. Although, this is probably one instance where using the verb should here would probably resolve the ambiguity here. So you could say something like this. Oops. It's important that you bake me cookies. As in, you bake me cookies and I find that an important fact. It's important that you bake me cookies. Versus, you don't bake me cookies, but I think you should. So here you could use the should to make the subjunctive meaning here more obvious. And the same works with the verbs suggest and insist. So you could say, I insist that you, so instead of saying like, I insist that you work there. Well, that could be either indicative or subjunctive. You could say, so that like, I insist you work there could be indicative or subjunctive. Let me type it out. This could be either. So you'd have to rely on the context. But you could put a should there to make the subjunctive meaning more obvious. I insist that you should work there. I insist that you work there. This could be either. I insist that you should work there. It can only be subjunctive. But that's like for any pronoun that isn't third person singular. So I insist that you should be worried about going to juvie. Exactly. But but like for third person singular pronouns such as he, she, and it, the difference between the two moods is obvious because that's the only area where the verb form changes. So I mean, if you want to use must there, you can. That works too, but if you really want to emphasize the necessity of someone doing something, but normally should will be fine. Normally should works. Okay. So when you have third person singular pronouns such as he, she, and it, the difference between the two moods is a lot more obvious. It's important that he study hard. Subjunctive. I want him to study hard. It's important that he studies hard. Indicative. We already know that he studies hard, and that's an important fact. So, So yeah, when it comes to he, she, or it, the difference between the moods is a lot more obvious, and you don't have to rely on the context. But the thing is that some people will use the indicative even when the sentence grammatically requires a subjunctive. So don't be surprised if you hear somebody saying something like "It's important that he studies hard," to mean it's important that he study hard. So let me actually type this out. Sometimes the indicative is used to convey a subjunctive meaning. So don't be surprised if you hear people say things like, it's important that he goes to the hospital, instead of, it's important that he go to the hospital. I think that happens more often in British English and Australian English than American English. In American English, we tend to use the subjunctive more often, but using the indicative there isn't wrong, but I recommend that you not do that, because you might like, because these sentences will sound more ambiguous if you use the indicative instead of the subjunctive. I mean, you can still rely on the context, but personally, whenever it comes to grammar, I try to be as unambiguous as possible. Because there are moments where I have read a sentence. There are moments in the past where I read a sentence and I couldn't tell if somebody meant to use the subjunctive or the indicative. And I was like, oh wait, do you mean that this should be the case or that this is the case? Because I honestly couldn't tell. Can you please repeat what the exact difference between them is? It's important that he study hard with the subjunctive. This means that someone doesn't study hard, but that, or may not study hard, I should say, but that someone wants him to study hard. Whereas the second one means that he studies hard, and that's an important fact. So the second one here shows that someone actually studies hard, whereas the first one means that someone wants him to study hard. So it's a difference. So the first one is more of a request. The second one is more of just an observation of fact. It's a factual statement. So that's the difference. Okay. So, as I was... Wait, what else was I going to say? Ew, some people spell programming like that? Gross. Ew. 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 No, I use two M's. Forget that. Ew. Ew. Just ew. But anyway. It's the first time that I don't hate the subjunctive. Good. Because some languages flat out don't use it. And if you thought the English subjunctive is confusing, well, don't learn the Spanish subjunctive, or the German one, or the French one. You will want to pull your hair out. But anyway. But yeah, that's the present subjunctive. So, as I said, you have... The French one is horrible. I can imagine. I can imagine. But, okay, so there are three more tense aspect combinations for the present subjunctive. Although, fair warning, they're not used very much. Like, you will rarely see them in writing, and you'll pretty much never hear them in speech. So the first one is the present continuous subjunctive. And here's an example of that I actually did see once in a textbook. Yeah, the French subjunctive does seem to be easier than the Spanish subjunctive. Like, it's not as present. Whereas in Spanish, the subjunctive is quite important. Like, it's used a lot. So here's an example of the present continuous subjunctive. It's not necessary that the function f be decreasing on this interval. It's not necessary that the function f be decreasing on this interval. So here we just use be and then an ing form. So again, the same logic applies. You use the base form for the auxiliary verb, and then you add ing. It's not necessary that the function f be decreasing on this interval. But again, this form is rarely used in writing. So if you haven't seen this before, well, that's to be expected. And you can also have a present perfect subjunctive. And if you're wondering why I didn't use just the present simple in the last example, the present continuous would actually be better there because a function's decreasing is not necessarily a habitual process. It can be an ongoing process. In other words, a function can be decreasing at certain points but not at other points. You know? Like for some functions, they decrease habitually, like y equals negative x. But for others, such as certain polynomial functions, like x to the fourth power, along with like x to the fourth plus 4x cubed plus x squared minus x or whatever, you can have multiple points where the function increases and decreases. So yeah, polynomial functions. So that's why I used the continuous form there. That would be more accurate. You could say it's not necessary that the function f decrease on this interval, but b decreasing sounds a bit better to me. Because a function's decreasing is not, it's more of an ongoing process. It's not necessarily habitual. But anyway, no, don't worry, I'm not turning this into a math lesson. But you can have a present perfect subjunctive. So here's another example. It's strongly recommended that the students have studied for 3 hours by the time they take their exam. It's strongly, oops, I forgot to, my bad, okay, there we go. It's strongly recommended that the students have studied for 3 hours by the time they take their exam. It's strongly recommended that the students have studied for 3 hours by the time they take their exam. So here we have a present perfect subjunctive. And it's similar to the present perfect indicative, except that this time it's used for a recommendation. And here the present perfect subjunctive implies that the action of studying didn't take place at a single point in time. Rather, it started at one point and continued into another point in time. Can you say no? Here only the subjunctive works. Although the weird thing is that, and let me actually change this sentence a bit. If you want to talk about what students, I changed it from the students to the students in this example. Here. Okay. So when you have singular, again, remember the subjunctive is marked for, the present subjunctive is marked for third person singular pronouns. So, or just singular nouns. It's strongly recommended that the student have studied for 3 hours by the time they take their exam. This isn't wrong, but almost no one would say this nowadays, so you're more likely to just hear the indicative in this context. It's strongly recommended that the student has studied for 3 hours by the time they take their exam. So the subjunctive isn't wrong, but the indicative would be used more commonly here. So because as I pointed out earlier, the present perfect subjunctive is rarely used in English nowadays. There we go. And you can technically like put a should in front of have studied if you don't want to use the subjunctive, but I don't really do that. You could, if you don't want to use the subjunctive there, you could just say it's strongly recommended that this, it's strongly recommended for the student to have studied. Like if you want to avoid the subjunctive, you could say that. You could say that, and that would be fine. So an alternative form could be this. And here we have the perfect infinitive here. So it's like the infinitive to study, but instead in study you have to have studied. So that's what we call a perfect infinitive. Oh, see you later, Cassie. I'll just call you Cassie for short. So you could say something like that. It's strongly recommended for the student to have studied for 3 hours by the time they take their exam. Okay. And of course there's the present perfect subjunctive form. Present perfect progressive subjunctive form. So you could say something like, so you could say something like this for the present perfect subjunctive. Oh, continuous subjunctive, sorry. It's vital that the children have been working on their chores by the time their mom comes home. It's vital that the children have been working on their chores by the time their mom comes home. But again, you'd be hard-pressed to find an example of this because almost no one uses it nowadays. Oh, you have to leave, Sereni? Okay, bye. Damn. Vital because she would kill them? Of course. Exactly. So really, the only commonly used form is the present simple subjunctive. The other forms are rarely, if ever, used. But I decided to teach you guys about them so that in the rare event that you do come across them, you'll know, oh, okay, this is just the subjunctive. I'll see you later, just a random guy. The only commonly used form for the present tense of the subjunctive mood is the present simple subjunctive. The other forms are rarely, if ever, used. Because really, in many of these examples I provided, you could literally just replace these with the present subjunctive. So you could even say, it's strongly recommended that the students study for 3 hours before they take their exam. You could say that. Thank God, right? It's like, yeah, whenever possible, at least in speech, try to, like, I would recommend that you not use the additional forms, because they would just sound weird to a lot of people. They were more common to use back then in history, but nowadays people don't use them for the most part. So you can just stick with the present subjunctive most of the time. It's okay. It's okay. Now with the past subjunctive, well, it's different because all 4 forms are actually used nowadays. They're still used nowadays. But but one thing I should point out. Okay, so remember, in English we use the base form of the verb, right? When we have the present subjunctive. But let me provide an example here to show because, okay, hold on. So in English, we use the base form of the verb for the subjunctive, but in other languages such as Spanish, you have a completely different set of conjugations. So here's an example. Es necesario que pospongamos la boda. So posponemos, the indicative, we postpone, becomes pospongamos, the subjunctive. But in English, we keep that same form here. It's necessary that we postpone the wedding. Postpone, indicative, becomes postpone, subjunctive. So you can see that in English, we don't really change the form. Well, except for third person singular pronouns, where in that case we just use the base form. But in Spanish, you have a completely different set of conjugations. So just keep that in mind. And let me put this here to make that a bit more obvious. Okay. So that's a difference. So like largely the subjunctive in languages like Spanish and French works similarly to the subjunctive works in English, although there are differences, but this is one area where they're pretty much the same. Okay, so now let's talk about the past subjunctive forms. So we have the past subjunctive, the past or past simple subjunctive, really doesn't matter. The past continuous subjunctive, the past perfect subjunctive, and the past perfect continuous subjunctive. So we have these 4 forms. We have the past simple subjunctive, the past continuous subjunctive, the past perfect subjunctive, and the past perfect continuous subjunctive. So, the past simple subjunctive. So remember, we use the past subjunctive when we want to express imaginary scenarios. So, for example, I wish I were taller. Oh, bye. See you later. Thank you for coming. I wish I were taller. This is the past subjunctive. I wish I were taller. Not I wish I was. Well, you could say I wish I was taller, but okay. So you can say I wish I was taller, but that's the indicative. And the subjunctive form would be I wish I were taller. But nowadays you can actually use was instead of were. You can actually say I wish I was taller. Was is now an acceptable alternative to the past subjunctive. You can say that. So you can say, if I was you, I wouldn't do this, instead of if I were you, I wouldn't do this. Although I would never say if I was you. I'm sorry, that sounds really bad to my ears. Just no, I would never say that. Because that's typically not how Americans would say it. Like, we tend to prefer the were form. But yeah, were is the past subjunctive for all persons. So, I were, you were, he were, etc. were. So, but again, you can use was. So you could say, if he was my boyfriend, I would be happy. Instead of if he were my boyfriend, I would be happy. Either is acceptable nowadays. So you could say, if he was my boyfriend, or if he were my boyfriend, then it'd be fine. I would go with were, but you can use was. It's fine. So, were is the past subjunctive for all persons for the verb to be. Let me type that in. For the verb to be. So, what about for all other verbs? What would the past subjunctive look like? What would the past subjunctive look like for all other verbs? If I had a girlfriend, I would be happy too. Oh, we're just talking about an overview of the English tenses, moods, voices, and aspects. I haven't covered voices yet, but we'll get to that later. So let's say we have the verb to have. What would be the past subjunctive form of that? Oops, I can't type today. What would be the past subjunctive form? And you can choose any person, it doesn't matter. Had, yeah, exactly. Had. Just had. So, yeah, exactly, it's easy. It's not like, say, Spanish, where you have a completely different form. In English, the past subjunctive looks just like the past indicative, except for the verb to be, which in that case, the past subjunctive would be were for all persons. If I were, if he were. So let's say we had indicative would be we had subjunctive. And just to show And just to show the difference between languages here. So in English, the two forms are generally the same. But in Spanish, for those of you who speak Spanish, the two forms are different. So in English, we had would in the indicative would be we had in the subjunctive. In Spanish, tuvimos or teníamos would be tuviéramos or tuviésemos in the subjunctive. So English has the same form, Spanish has two different forms. But the concept is the exact same. So that's just something to keep in mind. And I know I should put accent marks for those verbs in Spanish. I can't type it. I'm sorry, I just can't. But anyway, yeah, German has different forms as well, and French. German has mostly different forms. There are some instances where they're the same, but German has mostly different forms. Latin has completely different forms though, and so does French. At least I think French has completely different forms. I'm not entirely sure, but I know that they do have some distinction there. But in Spanish, the forms are completely different. So the indicative and subjunctive, completely different forms. Yeah, that's the thing. Like in German and French, like there's some distinction, but not entirely. Whereas in Spanish, there's a complete distinction. Whereas in English, there's mostly no distinction. So like it varies between the languages. Okay. Okay. So. Yeah, so for some regular verbs, then the whole conjugation thing would probably be pretty different in French. Irregular verbs tend to have like the most distinct conjugations. Like, I mean, in English, this is also the case. The verb to be is like the only verb that has a completely different set of conjugations in the subjunctive mood. You know, I for the present subjunctive, I be, you be, he be, and for the past subjunctive, I were, you were, he were. But for all other verbs, there's barely any distinction. So the irregular verbs are like the most distinct. Someone also pointed out earlier in class, like, what about when people say he be this or she be that or whatever? That's a dialectal thing. It's not the subjunctive. That's a dialectal thing. I meant to answer that question earlier, but I forgot. He do be kind of slick. Yeah, exactly. Like that kind of usage. That's dialectal. That's not a subjunctive form. Although there are times where you can have the subjunctive. See, the thing about the subjunctive is that it's mostly used in subordinate or dependent clauses, but there are times where you could just have them in the main clause. Have it in the main clause. So you could say something like this. Peace be with you. This isn't dialectal, actually. It is a true use of the subjunctive, but it's old-fashioned. It's old-fashioned, though. This is an idiomatic expression. It's an expression, an old expression. This is the subjunctive, but it's an old expression. Normally, you don't use the subjunctive in main clauses, but this is just one exception to that. But if you don't want to use the subjunctive there, you could say, may peace be with you. May peace be with you. And that's an alternative way of saying it. May peace be with you. Oh, that's how you'd say it in German? Oh, okay. I'm learning something new every day. But yeah, let's see. So let's talk about the um, the past continuous subjunctive. So what would that be? So he was being would be changed to what in the subjunctive form? He were being, exactly. Oh, I want you to change he was being the indicative to the subjunctive form, the past continuous subjunctive form. So, yeah, it would be he were being. If he were being locked up in prison, what would you do? If he were being locked up in prison, what would you do? You could also say was being here. That's fine too. Remember, was can be used instead of were for hypotheticals. That's fine. But I prefer to use were. I personally prefer to use were because that's a lot less ambiguous. Because there are contexts where you can use was after the conjunction if, but it would not be subjunctive. So, for example, Speaker A. I bet he was here last night. Speaker B. But if he was here, then why didn't we see him? In this case, the indicative is being used because we're not imagining something or wishing or wishing that something were true. We're talking about something that someone believes to be true. So here we have to use the indicative. The subjunctive wouldn't work. So here we're questioning a reality that has been asserted or believed to be true. So here the indicative is the only appropriate verb form. So yeah, just keep that in mind. The indicative mood just expresses facts and statements. But if he were to have been there, that's possible, but that's an imaginary scenario, which wouldn't really fit the context. I imagine it must be really annoying to learn all these rules for every single word. Not as annoying as Spanish. Fair. An example of the indicative, well, all humans breathe, don't they? All humans breathe. Isn't that the indicative? All humans breathe. It's a fact. So, it's the indicative mood. All humans breathe. All humans poop. All humans cry. Well, not all of them. All humans fart. All humans die. Well, the guy smothered with a pillow doesn't breathe anymore. Murderer. Murderer. Okay. But yeah, like, no, the indicative, no, you use, it's used for facts or statements. The indicative is used for, how do I explain this? Because, like, I kind of explained the difference already, but that was back like, a while ago. Okay, well, anyway. How do I explain this? Okay, so let me explain this difference one more time. Okay, so, yeah, exactly. The indicative is used to describe reality through absolution. He sees a therapist. Indicative. It's necessary that he see a therapist. Subjunctive. So in the first one, someone sees a therapist. That's a fact. In the second one, someone doesn't see a therapist, but someone else believes that it's necessary for the person to see a therapist. So that's the subjunctive there. That's the difference. So the indicative deals with reality, or strongly believed reality, or asserted reality, whatever. Whereas the subjunctive deals with wishes, imaginary scenarios, requests, recommendations, orders, whatever. And there's actually a name for things like requests, recommendations, necessity. They're called directives. So a directive is basically anything that involves a request, a recommendation, necessity, insistence. You get the idea. So when you say something like, I demand that he be here, that's a directive. I insist that you be more careful, that's also a directive. And so on and so forth. But anyway. Yeah, the subjunctive is basically subjective. Okay. So now we get to cover, the past perfect subjunctive and the past perfect progressive subjunctive. So the past perfect subjunctive. So, what the hell? Okay, there we go. Why the hell can I... My cursor's not working. Why are my arrow keys not working? There we go. Okay, so here's a question for you all. What is the past perfect subjunctive form of the verb to work? It doesn't matter what person it is, because had is like, that's the same for all persons. So what's the past perfect subjunctive form of the verb had worked? I literally just said the answer. I'm stupid. I meant to work. Well, never mind then. Oh god, I'm stupid. Okay, well, anyway. Yeah, it's had worked. So, the past perfect subjunctive form is had worked. It's had worked. So for example, if you had worked on this assignment earlier, you wouldn't have missed the deadline. If you had worked on this assignment earlier, you wouldn't have missed the deadline. And you'll notice that the past perfect subjunctive form looks exactly like the past perfect indicative form. So had worked is both indicative and subjunctive. And the difference, well, you can tell the difference from the context, obviously. It's pretty obvious. If you had worked on this assignment prior, you wouldn't have failed. Yeah, and you can even invert it. You can even say this. Although inverting it sounds a bit formal, but you can technically do this. So you can delete the conjunction if and move had to the front. Had you worked on this assignment earlier, you wouldn't have missed the deadline. Had you worked on this assignment earlier, you wouldn't have missed the deadline. Okay, boomer. Rest in peace, that's what it means. Thighs. Okay, anyway. So here's a question for you. Yeah, it's a conditional sentence. It's the third conditional. Okay, see you in a bit, Tommy. So, let's see. Okay, so here's a question for you guys. Which one here is indicative and which one here is subjunctive? If you had finished this assignment earlier, you wouldn't have missed the deadline. If you had finished this assignment by the deadline, then why was it marked late? So which sentence is in the indicative mood and which is in the subjunctive mood? And remember, in the subjunctive mood, you can invert you can invert the verb. And in the indicative mood, you can't. Okay, so I see two answers. No, Nyan Chad, you had it right the first time. You had it right the first time. You had it right the first time. No, you're fine. Don't change your answer. Yeah, exactly. See, you guys are so smart. Yeah, the first sentence, if you had finished the assignment earlier, you wouldn't have missed the deadline. That's subjunctive. The second sentence, if you had finished this assignment by the deadline, then why was it marked late? That's indicative. And see, the thing is that you can invert the subjunctive, the past perfect subjunctive. You can't do that with the indicative form, but you can do that with the subjunctive form. So you could say something. You can say this. Had you finished the assignment earlier, you wouldn't have missed the deadline. I didn't mean to underline that verb. I don't know why, but I'm too lazy to change it. But yeah, you can say that, but not for the second one. You can't invert the second. You can't invert the verb in the second sentence. That wouldn't make any sense. Because remember, only past perfect subjunctives can be inverted, not past perfect indicatives. So that's one way of telling the difference. So if you invert the past perfect form and the sentence makes sense, then it's a subjunctive. If not, then it's an indicative. But here, the difference is pretty obvious even without inversion. So, yeah, but really nobody mixes these up, not even learners. They're pretty hard to mix up. They're pretty easy to tell. It's pretty easy to tell the difference based on the context. And especially since the past perfect indicative or the past simple indicative, really, both, they're not really used very much after the conjunction if. So you don't really have to worry about this all that much because, again, you will rarely see them used after that conjunction. Because normally when you have if and you use a past perfect form or a past simple form, it's going to be subjunctive. Usually it's subjunctive. Oops. Okay. Okay. How much more do I have to cover? Not a lot. I need to cover the past perfect progressive subjunctive and then the conditional and imperative forms. And then that'll be it. I did not expect to take this long though. But anyway, a quick example for the past perfect progressive or continuous subjunctive. Progressive just means ing form. Okay, see you in a bit, Mr. Dog. Okay, so here's an example of the present perfect progressive subjunctive. If we hadn't been messing around, we wouldn't have gotten in trouble. If we hadn't been messing around, we wouldn't have gotten in trouble. And you can also say, of course, remember you can invert this too. So you could say, had we not been messing around. Nyan Chad. Had we not been messing around, we wouldn't have gotten in trouble. Had we not been messing around, we wouldn't have gotten in trouble. But inverting this is a bit more formal than not inverting it. My parents were chill about it. You must have amazing parents then. Oh, and I forgot to mention, you can technically invert the past simples, the past continuous subjunctive too. You can technically do that. So you could say something like this. Yeah, you can delete the if and put the verb at the front if you want. Oops. So you can actually invert here. You can delete the if and move the verb to the front. If you have like a verb phrase, so like 2 or more words in the verb. So you could say, if I were going to Spain, what would I bring? Or, were I going to Spain, what would I bring? So you could actually invert the past continuous subjunctive too. It's not common to do this though, but you can do that. Continuous and progressive mean the same thing in this context. So you could say past progressive subjunctive or past continuous subjunctive. Okay, so what else? Oh yeah, and if you have the verb were, you can just invert that as well. So you could technically say this. If he were here, he would know what to do. Were he here, he would know what to do. You can do that. It's a bit formal, but you can technically invert the verb here. Were he here, he would know what to do. If he were here, he would know what to do. Yeah, both sentences are correct. Yeah, the one's just inverted, the other one isn't. And if you have an infinitive after the verb were, then you can do that as well. Yeah, you're probably right, 9 chat. I'm sorry. I was not expecting the class to be this long. I think I'm just gonna I might just cover the rest of this. No, you're fine. You're fine. Yeah, you're fine. You're fine. You're absolutely fine. Yeah, this is getting a little too long. I'll probably cover... No, I think I'm just going to cover the conditional mood, the imperative mood, and the perfect... the infinitive forms and the perfect infinitive forms later. Yeah, that'll just be part of a different class. Oh, right, but one more thing I want to cover. So, as I said, you can invert subjunctive verbs if there are infinitives in them. So you could say something like so you can do this, or you can do this. Yeah, indicatives and subjunctives, yeah, those are moods, and tenses are tenses. And continuous and simple and perfect, they're all aspects. But anyway, if you were to be rich, what would you buy? You can actually invert that. You could say, were you to be rich, what would you buy? Nine, Chad. Or you can even do this with the perfect infinitive. So to have whatever, like to have seen or to have done or to have witnessed, whatever. So you could say something like, yeah, they both work in the same context. So yeah, like here it's just different syntax. That's it. Just different syntax. Just different syntax. And for this, if the criminal were to have been arrested, would that have given you some solace? Were the criminal to have been arrested, would that have given you some solace? So you can do that too. And this also works with progressive forms in the infinitive. So like to be working, to have been working, but I'm not going to cover those because you guys get the idea. You guys get the idea. But yeah, you can invert in all of these circumstances. So the only thing that you can't invert is just any past simple subjunctive verb that's regular. So like worked, danced, read, whatever. You can't invert those. Were is the only special verb form that you can invert. But yeah, that's so. Okay, so let's take a verb. So to conclude this class, and we're almost 3 hours in. We'll cover the conditional mood, imperative mood, and the infinitive forms later. So let's see. Okay, so let's conjugate for the verb to work. Let's do that. Okay, so let's do the indicative mood first. So let's see. Okay. Oops. Just typing things up here. Oh, hold on one moment. Let me change the... It'll be part 1 for this. I have to do the... The be here... I mean, I could see why you would think that the using to be there is a bit redundant. You could technically take that out if you want. You could just say if you were rich. That's fine. And that's fine. Like, really, you could say if you were to be rich or if you were rich. It doesn't matter. Okay. So, here's an overview of the verb to work in the indicative mood. Present simple, work or works. I work, you work, he works, so on and so forth. Present continuous. Am, is, are working. I am working, he is working, you are working. Present perfect, has, have worked. I have worked, he has worked, you have worked. Present perfect continuous, has, have been working. I have been working, you have been working, he has been working, so on and so forth. Past simple, worked. Past continuous, oops, I forgot to put was or were there. My bad. Okay. Past simple, worked. Past continuous, was, were working. I was working, you were working, he was working. Past perfect, had worked. Past perfect continuous, had been working. Future simple, will work. Future continuous, will be working. Future perfect, will have worked. Future perfect continuous, will have been working. Yeah, it's an example of inversion. Like, look up verb inversion and you'll understand it better. Verb inversion. I forgot to mention, you can also do this with should, the verb should. Should can be inverted, so you could say something like this. So you could do this. If you should be late, give them a call. Should you be late, give them a call. So you can invert should. And you can invert really any form of should. So you can invert say, should work, should be working, should have worked, and should have been working. All those can be inverted. But I'm not going to bother providing an example for every single one. Just not going to bother with that. But yeah, if you should be late and should you be late, they both have the same meaning. Yeah, it conveys the same message. So you can, yeah. So Okay. So yeah, you can invert pretty much any verb with should in it. So all these forms can be inverted. But I'm not going to provide an example for every single one because I am tired as hell. Anyway. The second one isn't going to be understood as a question. No, because the context makes it pretty clear that it's a statement. And it also depends on how you say it. Because in English, you change the inflection of a sentence at the end to express it as a question. So, should you be late is different from should you be late? So you can see that those two sound very different from each other. So they would be read differently. Yeah, see, now you get it. Oh, if you're wondering, like, okay, where is there a channel to see all these tenses? I can just pin it. Let me pin this one. Let me cover the subjunctive forms as well. So, I was going to type up this equivalents to all these forms in Spanish because Spanish does have equivalents, but I'm too tired to do that. You can just look those up yourself if you're curious. Okay, so here's what the subjunctive mood would look like conjugated, fully conjugated. So no unique conjugations for person. And let me pin this as well. Okay, and I'm getting tired, but that was fun. Yeah, that's basically how I would describe the tenses, Tommy. But anyway, I think I've covered all the tenses for the indicative and subjunctive mood. Oh, yeah, and I'll cover like active voice and passive voice later. I didn't get a chance to do that today. We will cover that later. So uh, we'll cover the conditional mood, the imperative mood, the all the infinitive forms, like to work, to be working, to have worked, to have been working, and the and active voice and passive voice next time. So we'll cover all that next time. So in this lesson, we covered... Alright, here, also let me point this out. So, English tenses, present, past, and future. Okay. So we'll just do that. And so you have the English tenses, present, past, and future. English verbal aspects, simple, continuous, perfect, and perfect continuous. And English moods, indicative, subjunctive, imperative, and conditional. We'll cover the imperative and conditional later. I'm not going to cover them now. This class has already gone on long enough. So, yeah, I pinned all of these here. Okay, so in this lesson, we covered the indicative mood, the subjunctive mood, the subjunctive mood, the three tenses, and the four verbal aspects. So, the next lesson we will cover the conditional mood, the imperative mood, the infinitive forms, and the two voices, active and passive. I'll get to that in a moment. Hold on, everyone. So in this lesson, we covered the indicative mood, the subjunctive mood, the three tenses, and the four aspects. In the next lesson, we'll cover the conditional mood, the imperative mood, the infinitive forms, and the two voices, active and passive. So that'll be fun. So, I'm tired, but that is it for this lesson, and I will stop recording.